I just graduated medical school from the University of Pittsburgh, and I'm excited to share with you why I believe that most bad test takers have the potential to be great. When I was a kid, my mom knew I was special, but not in a good way. Not like how everyone else's mom talks about them when they were a kid, but my mom knew I was special because I couldn't talk. So she took me to 3 years of speech therapy, but our problems didn't end there, because when I got to grade school, I couldn't read. And so my poor mom would drive 4 hours a day on the weekends to take me to special classes on how to teach students with learning disabilities. Eventually, I was diagnosed with dyslexia, dysgraphia, and auditory processing disorder, all which means that my brain struggles to read and write accurately. I was so bad at reading when I was a kid that I put the lit in illiterate. So I always struggled academically, especially with test taking. I remember studying as hard as I could for the SAT, determined to get into a prestigious college just so that I could show I was smart too. And it went like this. I still did way worse than all my friends, and I was sick and tired of working so hard and feeling so stupid. And the worst part of it all was that I wanted to be a surgeon. So that meant that my future depended on me getting better at standardized exams. And I did. When I took the MCAT, the entrance exam for medical school, I scored in the 99th percentile, the highest score my college had seen in 35 years. But the weirdest part of it all for me was that no one asked me how I did it. They just wrote me off saying, "You're just really smart," or "I'm not a great test taker like you are." But that didn't make any sense because I had a lifelong history of being a bad test taker. So that's when I realized that most people believe that academic performance comes from hard work and God-given talent, which explains a lot. We all know smart people who don't work very hard, and so they turn out average. We know hardworking people who just aren't that smart, and so they turn out average too. We know smart people who apply themselves, and they do great. And we all know smart people who brag about how little work they do and nobody likes them. This hard work and talent framework is depressing because it means that your potential is limited. You can't change your God-given talent, and there's only 24 hours a day to work. So most people believe that because they weren't born great test takers, they will never be the best, and fear that their best will never be good enough. My transformation from a hard-working, low-scoring test taker to a great test taker has given me a different perspective on standardized exams and these 3 ideas that took me from where I was to where I am today. My first piece of advice is about choosing your resources. Picking your study material is one of the most crucial and painful parts about any exam. There's always 50 different options, ranging from your friend's tattered notebooks to the $3,000 all-inclusive ripoffs. People get overwhelmed at this step and develop a condition called the paralysis of the analysis. From there, they make one of 2 mistakes. They either do the same thing as some high-scoring person, even though they don't learn in the same way they do. Or they do the same thing as their friend, who might learn in a similar way, but didn't score that high. To avoid both of these pitfalls, focus on finding 3 people who learn the way you do and achieved your goal score. You can find them in your friends, acquaintances, anywhere, but make sure you ask them a lot of specific questions about how they did it. What helped me for the MCAT was that there were these long forums where people would discuss what resources they used, how they studied, and key factors about themselves, like they hate flashcards, or they need books with lots of pictures, or they have learning disabilities. And so I felt very confident going into my preparation, knowing that I was doing the same thing that people like me had succeeded with. Everyone's going to come out of this process with a slightly different plan. But you should keep in mind that all successful plans use 3 types of resources. This graph shows your learning and retention curve when you study from books. You can see that books are the best way to learn a new idea, but they're terrible for retaining it. In fact, the day after you learn something new, you will have forgotten most of that information, and by the 31st day, you'll only remember 20% of it. This is a major problem for anyone who's studying for an exam for months at a time. And the way we combat it is by having a reviewing resource that changes your retention curve to this, where each bump represents a time you review the information again. The most efficient way to review is by using spaced repetition flashcards, where a program keeps track of your schedule and shows you the cards you need to see each day. Since I know most people don't like flashcards, other options are having a schedule to reread old book chapters or to redo old practice questions. The last type of resource you'll need are practice questions that teach you how to apply the information and understand how test writers think. But these are only useful if you've been able to retain all of that information for a long period of time. My second piece of advice is to have an emergency fund, which means staying 3 days ahead at all times. When I tell people to stay ahead, they look at me like I'm their mom, nagging them to do their homework on time. And to that I say, if you had listened to your mom in the first place, you wouldn't need this talk right now. Because she was right. Research has shown that falling behind is a predictor of poor academic performance, whereas staying ahead gives you confidence and peace of mind in what you're doing. I became convinced that everyone should have an emergency fund after I got sick 3 days before one of my finals in medical school. I was so relieved that I could just take those days off and relax without having to worry about how I would do on the exam, and I still scored 10 points above the class average. This is the graph I used to keep track of my emergency fund when I studied for the most important medical board exam, the one that would determine which specialties I could apply it to. The orange line represents how much work I've scheduled to do each day, and the yellow line represents how much I've done. The space in between is the emergency fund, and you can see that even when there are holidays or I just need a day off, those lines never touch, showing that I'm always ahead of schedule. There's nothing special about having an emergency fund, but the effect it'll have on you will make you special, because everyone gets burnt out from studying. And when that happens to you, you'll be able to take those days off and relax without stressing about falling even further behind. In short, the emergency fund allows you to sleep better and perform better than your competition. My last piece of advice is about finding what works for you. Anyone who's ever struggled academically has found themselves in a meeting with a well-meaning academic counselor who tells you that all of your problems would be solved if you could just find what works for you. This is actually the most annoying piece of advice in all of test taking, because no one actually explains how to do it. So I feel more stupid leaving the meeting than I did going in. Why is it challenging for experienced academic counselors to help students improve? As someone who's made a lot of mistakes, inside and outside of the classroom, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the different types of mistakes. A few years ago, my brother asked me to help him with his ice bucket challenge video, and this is how it went.
I'd like to thank Lauren Lee and Mary Sue Thompson for nominating me for the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. I'd like to nominate Elijah Edwards, Nina Graybill, and Jeremy
Physical mistakes like this one are obvious, and that makes them easy to diagnose and easy to treat. Whereas mental mistakes are invisible, and that makes their diagnosis and treatment difficult. For example, here's a picture of me losing a game in a chess tournament. And just by looking at my face, you can't tell how the game's going or what mental slip caused me to lose. And it's the same thing with test taking. Because the mistakes are invisible, the first step to finding what works for you is having a process to make mental mistakes as obvious as physical mistakes. My first student hired me to teach him test-taking skills for his second attempt at the MCAT. The first thing I had him do was take a practice test and categorize his wrong answers as either knowledge mistakes or test-taking mistakes. To his surprise, at the end of the exercise, he recorded 16 knowledge mistakes and only one test-taking mistake. And so we didn't do any work on test-taking skills for months because that wasn't the source of his problem. This is why I recommend that all bad test takers try this exercise, because most bad test takers are not bad test takers. They simply miscategorize their mistakes, which is why they find it impossible to improve. But once you've diagnosed your problem, you can start looking for the cure. When I was studying for the MCAT, my Achilles heel was the verbal reasoning section, where each question is based on a long passage. I found that I couldn't comprehend all of the details and read fast enough to finish the section on time. So I knew I had to GTFO. I had to go try further options. So I designed an experiment where every 2 weeks I would rummage through old MCAT books and try a different verbal reasoning strategy. After doing this for 2.5 months, I found that I got my best scores when I didn't focus on the details and instead tailored everything towards understanding the main idea. This realization allowed my scores to skyrocket, and I ended up in the 99th percentile. Finding what works for you takes self-awareness and perseverance, but the fruits of it have changed the trajectory of my life, and it can for you too. So now I'm off to UC San Diego to begin my career as an orthopedic surgeon. I've learned that test taking is about more than just talent and hard work. It's also about your process. All of those people who assumed that my scores were a result of talent alone were missing that I had been building up my process. Everyone understands that the education system is deeply flawed. That doesn't mean that your dreams have to be a victim of it. If you would just invest a little bit of your hard work into your process, your potential is limitless. Thank you.